Okay, so let's get this thing started. Hello and welcome to our tuning session for marine audio. This is our basic tune for marine sessions. My name is Steve Teresi. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Services here at JL Audio. I'm located down in southern Florida, just a few miles north of the main headquarters for JL Audio. I have with me Mr. Rob Haynes out in Southern California. Say hello, Rob.
Hello, everyone.
There we go. And our presenter today is Mr. Kevin Ferry. He's up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. Say hi, Kevin.
Hello, everybody.
Fantastic. So just as a reminder, we are streaming in two locations. One is our WebEx channel, which if you are on WebEx, over on the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see the chat window. If you don't see it, there's some buttons along the bottom of your screen. One looks like a little chat bubble. You click on the chat bubble and your chat window should show up. I'll be minding that chat pretty actively, and Rob will be peeking in on it. We also have people watching on Facebook Live. If you are on Facebook Live, there's that area there. You can put your questions and comments in, and Rob will be heading that one up mostly, but I'll be peeking in on that as well. The person who won't be peeking in is Mr. Kevin Ferry. He'll be too busy presenting, so he will not see any of the chat conversation, including private messages, until after he's done presenting. So if you need some information to be shared with him, share it with either myself in WebEx or with Rob over on Facebook, and we'll make sure that Kevin gets that information in a timely manner. So these sessions are all specifically designed for the web, and in that end, we want to make sure they're focused and relatively short. Our focus is usually a 30 to 45-minute session, and within 5 minutes or so, we've been pretty good about hitting that. And I'm cutting into Kevin's time, so I'm going to stop now and pass it over to Kevin. Kevin, take it away.
Yes, we are. All right. So if you haven't guessed by yet, this is the basic tune session for the JL Audio training online, and this is going to be based around MVI and tuning vessels. We're going to kind of go over the process, step-by-step guide. We're really going to start off with just a general guide and recommendations of the process. Now, there are some areas in the order that can be changed around. So if you're more comfortable doing some of these processes in a different order, that is completely up to you and how much you are comfortable doing it and really developing your own personal tuning process. Then we'll walk through tuning each area of the vessel, followed up by tuning for presets. Now, when we're talking about each area of the vessel and tuning for that specific area, you'll notice that when we get into the presets, they really coincide with one another. So it's very simple to make some minor adjustments after you've tuned to a specific zone to just make that zone a preset or that specific listening environment a preset. So what will the basic marine tune do for you? Well, a properly tuned system will really ensure a great day out on the water. Not only enjoyable, but reliable listening experience is really what we're looking for. You're out on the lake, you're out for the day for the most part, or at least a few hours at minimum. So we want to make sure that it's enjoyable and it is going to be reliable for the customer. We don't want somebody to have their levels set up too high and end up damaging a speaker, pull their boat out of the lake and bring it to get it fixed. So we want to make sure that it's very reliable, but they're still getting the maximum performance out of the system, and they're able to really enjoy that system in each zone of their vessel. By breaking down the zones of the boat, we really simplify the process. Like we said, long days, loud music, they really go hand in hand out on the river, the lake, the beach, or even at the dock. So we need to make sure that these things are very reliable. Now, tuning a boat is very different than tuning for home or a mobile system. You need to consider tuning each zone as a separate system rather than the entire boat as one. When it comes to using the power of the MVI product, you might be tempted to optimize the setting for a specific listener. However, we can talk about this and get into this. However, when we really want to talk about it's a party on your vessel. So it's not just one person sitting in a chair on a couch or sitting in the driver's seat listening to it while they're going to work in the morning and coming back. When you're out on the vessel, it is a party. You have more than one person that you're out there trying to impress or have a good time with. You got to make sure that the person that's buying the lunch and buying your gas is also having a good experience on that vessel. So even though we're used to maybe going in and dialing things in for a specific listener, we really want to take a look at the entire zone itself. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the bleed over for the zones too. And we're going to go in and talk about the presets and kind of wrap up with presets and activating, deactivating zones, and really kind of making sure that those presets are set up for those different conditions. So let's put it to work. The first thing you have to do is configure the amplifier. Now, Tune software really helps setting up the MVI easy with the ability you can use a tablet, computer, or even a phone for a quick setup. However, even with this basic tune that we're discussing today, you're going to have to get into it with a tablet or a computer. They will be required with Tune Mobile or Tune installed. Now, Tune Express is great for getting the system up and running. However, we are taking it to that next level. We're doing some presets, we're doing some tuning, so we need to make sure we're using a full-blown version of Tune rather than just Express. Now, we want to start with getting the basic system configured in Tune with safe starting points for your high-pass and low-pass filters. These may change as we go through the tuning process, so don't try to really dial in your frequencies for your high-pass and low-pass filters or any of that. Just pick 80 Hertz, 24 dB Linkwitz Riley. It's a great starting point for your mid-bass drivers and your subwoofers. You can go in and adjust these down the line. We just want to get some safe starting points for the speakers, so that way when we are running music and doing all of that, we can listen to them without having to worry about damaging the speakers. Now, the last thing is do you need to input your distances for delays? We probably can, but we'll get into what those distances should actually be, and we'll get into that here in a minute. So after Tune is configured and you get your signal routed, input sensitivity should be the next step, and it really should be your first step. A proper input sensitivity setting is important for getting the most out of the amplifier and keeping the entire system reliable. The nice thing about MVI is we use clipping indicators on both the input sensitivity and actually on the outputs too of the amplifier, and it is available in all versions of Tune. These clipping indicators really help simplify this process in getting you input sensitivity and output taken care of. So the first thing that we're going to mention is we're going to play a sine wave in the passband of the channels that we're setting. So if we're setting some speakers that are playing full range, then we would use kind of a signal that's around 1K for the most part, and that really works. If it's a mono or subwoofer amplifier, then you'll want to use something that is a lower frequency that plays within the range of that specific amplifier and speaker. Now, if you don't have these files, they are available on the JL Audio Help Center for free. So feel free to go in and download them. And since we're playing a sine wave, we do want to make sure that our outputs are muted on there. So we want to make sure that they're muted. You can disconnect them, or you can even set this up before you connect the speakers on there. But since we are playing a sine wave, you don't want to be running a sine wave through all of your speakers for any type of duration. So we want to mute those, and we can do that right there in the Tune software. Then once we have...
Real quick, Kevin. Yeah. When downloading files from our help center, make sure you guys don't compress them. So if you're an iPhone user, don't put them in whatever the heck it's using now. I think iTunes is gone. Music, whatever. It compresses the file. You want to make sure if you're going to go digital with them, try to maintain that wave format that the download from our help center uses. Any compression is going to remove some key information on the top end that could affect the levels, and especially on pink noise when we get into the tuning process. And secondly, that mute icon Kevin was just talking about, man, on MVI, I love that. You know, on boats, it's tough to get into some of these compartments and unplug and make, you know, disconnect, reconnect speakers. So from an install point of view, being able to sit in the captain's chair or wherever you are and just boop, mute the speakers so you can set your levels and then unmute them, that is so much nicer than having to go to every single output and individually reconnecting them after you disconnect them to set your levels.
Yeah, I definitely use the mute button more often than not. But if you are extra careful, you can go in and disconnect the speakers too, or set this up prior to connecting them. Just depends on what your preference is. Thanks, Rob. So then up in the upper left-hand corner next to inputs, you can see that the icon is highlighted there in orange. So we're going to go ahead and select that. We'll play our 1K sine wave at about 3/4 volume on the receiver, making the assumption that the receiver will not be clipping at that setting. Keep in mind that is an assumption. And to get on to further go with Rob's point, use a USB or CD if possible. It is just a way more reliable format than trying to do Bluetooth over it. And if you have the tools to measure the signal out of the receiver, even better. So if you can measure that signal coming out and see where it starts to clip with a O-scope or anything like that, then great. Then you have that information, and maybe you can dial it up a little bit more than 3/4, or maybe you need to dial it down a little bit more than 3/4. But 3/4 volume is a pretty safe assumption on there. Now, we want to go through and change the input sensitivity level to the highest numerical value that stays yellow and does not go red. Red is very bad, so that is clipping, and you do not want to clip the input of the DSP or of a digital amplifier in general. So make sure that you do not have those as red. That is extremely, extremely important. If you take one thing from the training today, it's getting that input sensitivity set up properly. Now green, you might see a green light on there, and that means you have a little bit more room to work with, so you can go up. And it is as easy as that. So you get that indicator to be full yellow without going red, and you are set up on your input sensitivity. Now, if they are constantly red no matter what the value is, then you may want to look deeper into the output source that you're using. If they're gray, that means there's no output or no input coming into the amplifier. So that you can use those lights for some troubleshooting also on there. Now, like I said, you want to make sure that they are set up properly. If they're not, it is going to make your tuning process exponentially more difficult, if not impossible. So getting a good setting here is extremely important. Keep in mind, you will have to set the input sensitivity for each set of inputs coming in. In this case, we would have to set each one of those, which is all four, up correctly to get that constant yellow input. If you only have 2 inputs, then you only have to set it for those 2 specific inputs.
Hey, Kevin.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with a source unit that you know really well, something like, oh, I don't know, maybe a Media Master, if you already know what number works on that, nothing really changes, right? You could just put that number directly in. Like, for example, if you set zone 1 and it shows up to, I don't know, what is it, 6, could you just put 6 on all the other ones?
You can, as long as all the zone volumes are set up equally and you're good to go on that one. You could absolutely do that, but you will want to go through the settings and make sure that your levels are all set up the same and equally out on the Media Master or whatever receiver that you're using, if it has multi-zone volume control at that point. If it doesn't have multi-zone volume control, then yes, you could go through and most likely, but I would always double check it just because I'm that double checking kind of guy. Alrighty. So after our input sensitivity is set, we need to start looking at the tuning process, and we want to tune to a preset curve. Here's 4 target curves that may be helpful. The tan one is kind of what our normal curve would be. When you set out to tune the system, you should look at the raw response and see which one of these 4 target curves looks to be as close to what your measurement is. So you take your acoustical measurement of the system and you look at these 4 curves and you see which curve kind of mimics what the natural system or what the system is doing naturally for you, and then you tune to that specific curve. Picking a curve that is close to your measured response will require less manipulation to really get things dialed in. So it's going to have a little bit more natural sound, and it's also going to be a little bit less work on the end getting that tuned in. The goal of the target curve is to allow you to arrange the energy in a manner that is generally pleasing. And all of these curves really should do that. However, once you kind of get your curve down, we're going to say this again, is listen, 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 and listen. So make sure that you are listening after you have gone to your curve. Because even though you might dial it into one of these curves, it may not, you may have some weirdness going on from somewhere else in the vessel that's causing it to not sound good. So make sure that you do listen after you've picked your curve and taken a look at your acoustical measurements.
One thing I find interesting about those curves, actually, if you can go back real quick, Kevin, I would actually say, I know we talked about in the car session, trying to pick the curve that best mimics what the vehicle's naturally giving you. I honestly, if it was me, I would probably focus on the top two curves, knowing in the marine environment, we're going to have a lot more upper mid-range and high frequency cancellation. I like the bottom two for the cars because that helps typically tame reflective surfaces and take away some of the aggressiveness that we get from tweeters coming off the windshield and dash. But in the boat where we're wide open on the water, wind, noise, all that stuff that creates that upper high frequency cancellation, I think those top two would probably be the ones I would recommend to make sure we get that overall experience and factoring in what the environment's going to do to it.
And knowing, you know, the M6 and M3 products, they're probably naturally going to show you one of those two in the vessel too, right? So normally the speakers themselves are tuned to have a little bit more energy up top to overcome some of that stuff too. So they're probably going to end up showing you one of those two. But we give you all four just in case. Again, just pick whichever one's closest, and that will get you going in the right direction. Thanks, Rob.
Just real quick on that, Kevin. Shane on Facebook just said, agree 100%. He said he did a boat with a tweak, interestingly enough, and the top curve is what showed up. And I was actually going to interrupt and say that top curve is probably what you're going to see a lot in boats. So yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for clarifying all of that, because there are going to be differences in the way a system presents.
So when you're trying to tune your system or tune to a response curve, knowing when to stop is the most important thing. Steve, you're up.
No, I'm not going to do it. Doing the banana joke. Kevin, you got to do it now.
I can't bring myself to do the banana joke, Steve. So nope, you got it.
The banana joke is this, that tuning is much like, you know, spelling the word banana. I know how to spell it, but I just don't know when to stop. And tuning, you have to have a place to stop. What Kevin is suggesting here is getting into a certain window and getting really freaking close, and then just stopping and getting to the point where you listen to it to see what it really sounds like, because you don't really hear a curve. You hear an audio system, and if you can tune it to the target curve, then you can start to listen to it and determine if it's presenting itself in a favorable way. So when we looked at those four different curves, it may present as if it lines up on those curves really, really nicely, but it just doesn't sound good. So you got to get it and listen. And the sooner, in my opinion, the sooner you get to the listening, the sooner you're getting to a point where the system's going to sound great. So I know when to tune and I know when to stop tuning. So that's the banana joke.
So you can
hold on. Something came up. Someone's asking about tuning on a windy day on site at a marina.
That's a tough one. That is a tough one. You know,
it's tricky because the microphone is going to be affected by the wind pretty badly. There are certain measurement systems that are far outside the scope of what we're talking about with a basic tune that can allow you to, I call it, see through some of the noise. But if it gets particularly bad, you just got to wait. You have to find a way to shelter from some of that. Now, the awkward thing about it is windy environments, that's what you're in. The boat is going to be windy when you're out on the water or moving. You have self-generated wind at that point. So although it's very real for the environment, in a tuning situation, it screws with the measurements pretty badly. If it comes down to that, there are, you can get, sorry for the noise here, but little things like this that are like a windscreen kind of thing that can help minimize some of the noisy effects.
I'd say the cattail helps too.
The cattail is a big fuzzy furry thing that goes onto some of those microphones. They call them cattails. That can help, but even those are going to be very susceptible to it. You just wait for it to not be so windy. I know that's not a good answer and it sounds very dismissive, but you know the truth is if there's direct wind on the microphone, you're not going to get good reading. So
right. So like Steve said, you can always try to squeeze more out of it, but really, is it going to make a difference out on the water? And really, you want to get to the listening part as fast as possible. We tend to stick around plus or minus 5 dB mark. And what that means is looking at the graph and the target curve as at 60 dB. So we want to keep our measured frequency response into between 55 and 65 dB or within that red shaded area that we're showing there. Now, viewing most of these frequency response graphs, whether it is REW or audio tools or any of the ones that you may be using, they're all generally the same with frequency at the bottom going from lower frequencies on the left to higher frequencies on the right, and amplitude measured in dB usually goes vertically from the lower amplitude at the bottom to the higher amplitude up top. The number designations, I've seen them both on the left and right side depending on which type of application you're using, but the principle is usually the same there. So when we talk about that plus or minus 5 dB, we just want to keep it kind of where that red shaded area is. We go up from the red line 5 dB and down from the red line 5 dB. So this is actually a great example of a measured frequency response lining up with the target response curve. This is actually just about plus or minus 3 dB. Now we would just want to go through and make the other speakers match in the system. So it's more important to get the speakers to match one another than it is necessarily to get to match that specific curve. So now that we figured out where we need to end, let's look at where we need to start. Starting with the farthest speaker from the microphone will help. This will help with the levels. As you get closer, you will find yourself cutting the levels of the speakers that are closer to the mic. So you start with the farthest speaker from the mic and then work your way in. If you start with the close speaker and move away, you may end up having to boost the speakers that are far away. If we've learned anything from our earlier sessions, distance makes a difference with the measured SPL. So by starting with the closest, it's really going to help us down the line, especially with setting our levels. Now, by breaking up each section down and tuning to a zone, it really simplifies the process. You will also notice as we get into the presets, these zones really do coincide with some really good suggested presets. So we're going to go through and we're going to break these down by the bow speakers, by the helm, stern, and any other zones that the vessel may have or that the boat may have. As we're tuning these zones, one of the nice things is that you're breaking it down to maybe 4, 6, maybe it's even only 2 speakers at one time that you're tuning. But when you take a look at some larger vessels that may have 10 speakers up in the bow and then 10 speakers in the helm and stern area, having to tune all of those at one time is going to be a little bit overwhelming to somebody that may just be getting into it. Maybe overwhelming to some of us that do tuning on a fairly regular basis. So by breaking it up to these zones, it is really going to help simplify this process. Now, for examples, we're going to use a typical 20 to 40 foot boat here. This specific one is a towboat, but you can apply these ideas to just about any type of vessel. This one will show us 5 distinct zones. One of them, the helm and stern section, can be treated as one zone for some applications. If your boat has a cabin or a fly bridge, those would be separate zones as well. The only things that may change is how much one zone may impact another zone. So depending on how the bow of a center console may impact the cockpit area differently than it would on this specific towboat. So you may have some different interactions that you have to go through and make some minor adjustments to, but again, the principles are the same. So if we start in the bow of this vessel, we have to make a choice on where to place the microphone for measurements, knowing that for all time-related measurements, we need a single point of reference. So who do we optimize for? Remember, as good as it gets for one person, you can expect maybe a little bit of degradation for the others. We would recommend picking a central point between the listeners so that way the entire zone can sound great. No one seat is better than the other, and the entire zone will have a great sound. This may mean that you are not taking advantage of all of the phase and signal delay related functions of the MVI, but we can use those features when we get into some different aspects of the process. Moving to the main section of the boat, there really are two sections here, the helm and the stern or aft section. The helm should probably be treated as an independent zone, but we're still faced with one question. Where do we put the microphone? Well, in this case, we know that there's going to be someone pretty important sitting or maybe standing here. So we might be tempted to really drop the mic there and do the tuning for that specific zone or for that specific listener. And you can do that. That makes a great preset if the customer just wants to have a single person listening environment. So you can make that as a preset. Should you tune the entire system for that specific person? Probably not, but if you want to make a preset, you can go ahead and do that. Because what happens is, if you tune to that preset, what happens to the other guys on the far side of the boat? They are kind of screwed, right? So instead of screwing those people over that you're probably trying to impress, you know, the person on the left may have bought you the beer, the person on the right may have bought you gas for that day. You want to impress those guys too. So you might want to pick a more central location so that way everybody has a good experience in the vessel. Again, it's not so much about one person, it's about the party and the environment that's going on and everybody having that great sound. So we'll go ahead and take our measurement there in the center. Now, if we look at the stern or aft section, we can treat that as another zone. It may not always have a separate control on the source unit, but it can be identified as a different listening location for tuning purposes. And this one has a large number of locations where people may sit. So where do we focus? Again, finding a central location is highly, you know what, I always think, man, I wish I had this many friends. So a central location is highly recommended. And it's funny, as you get older, you end up more in this location than in the bow of the vessel. I remember as kids, we'd always sit up in the bow of my parents' boat, and now as we get older, we kind of move or migrate back into this location here. So again, we picked this central location, and it really is highly recommended. Now, another approach may be to treat the helm and the stern zones as one. And in this case, a central location makes the most sense as well. So now everybody is going to have a good listening experience in those two zones. Remember, when you are tuning for those two zones, they do directly correlate with one another. The helm zone is going to have effect on the stern. So you want to make sure that you take that into account. So another area directly behind the boat is another key audio zone. In this case, there's a swim platform where you can put a good number of people. Dropping the mic right in the middle of the zone is your best bet. Not dropping the mic directly in the middle of the water, but in the middle of that zone. So make sure that you are maybe doing this on a trailer, or maybe you back the vessel up or the boat up to the dock was a good suggestion in the last training, and then put the microphone on the dock there. Having the mic out on an inner tube floating out there probably isn't the best bet for your personal equipment there. So even if the vessel does not have a swim platform, this zone makes sense because the owners may want to entertain while at the dock. Again, that is a great way to go through and do your tuning there. So having the system sound really good in this area right along the outside of the boat can make sense. And again, you guys are going to notice as we're talking about doing tuning for these, presets are going to really come into play too. Now, for the last zone out on the boat, let's consider the rider. This zone's not only positioned well outside of the boat, but also extends outward towards the left and right sides of the boat. So your person who's wakeboarding back there, I don't want to say skiing because it always dates myself, but your person that's back there wakeboarding or tubing or whatever they're doing back there, they're not always going to be in the center location of the wake there. So you're going to have a little bit offset to the left and right side. So logically, we should do this at the rider's position. So we want to kind of know what our toe length is, and we want to take those measurements behind there where they would be. Another nice thing about this zone is it can also be used for like a sandbar type of application too. Or maybe your boat is parked at a dock and it's a short dock and people are standing right on the shoreline there. You can also use this for that type of application also. So it really does help. And again, when we talk about presets, you'll notice how well that they coincide when you are tuning these specific zones.
One quick note about that particular situation, subwoofers are a challenge to get to project well behind the vessel like that. So when you are tuning for it, just bear in mind, don't go crazy trying to jack up the sub to try to compensate for the distance that you are, because the sub is inside the boat and this is not inside the boat. So it's very difficult to get the same level of bass on shore in that example as you would on the boat. And you know, Neil in our WebEx chat here say just go full send on the gains for this particular zone. I hope he's partially kidding there, because that could be very damaging, because you won't even hear the sub screaming for its life if you overdo it. So just be mindful that when you get further away and you're loading differently, be mindful that you may not get the same level of performance without some significant system design.
All I heard right there was add more subs to the system. That's add more subs to the system and just turn them down for when you are in your cruising preset, right?
Hey, real quick, got a comment about tuning for the swim deck. Should the boat be in the water or dry dock, or does it matter?
Sorry, I heard. Rob, did you want to take that?
I was answering the question on Facebook. I didn't hear the question.
Oh, sorry. I thought I heard you chime in there. So depending on where it's at and what your goals are, you can do it on a dry dock. Obviously, the water is going to give you maybe a little bit hair of a different reflection on there, but doing it on the dry dock is a little bit safer too. So there are some pluses and minuses on both of those. You may want to do most of your measurements and all of that if you can on a dry dock. Then when it goes into the water, go ahead and make some minor adjustments at that point. If you have that option to do so, that would be my preference. But honestly, the differences between the water, you'll have some smaller reflectivity, but I don't think it's going to be a night and day difference if you do majority of your tuning on the dry dock there.
I think in the water, the only real impact you would really notice would be the subwoofers if you're doing infinite baffle, only because of the extra pressure on the hull. It's not going to flex as much as when you were tuning, so you might get a little extra output, but other than that, I don't think there's much you would need to change on the mid-range, high-frequency side of things.
Yeah. Alrighty. So now that we have an idea where to put the microphone and start to tune things, it's a good idea to talk about exactly what the goals are when we tune. If your goal is proper imaging, you need to address the 3 pillars of audio. The first pillar is frequency response. And that is making sure that all of your channels in your zone's frequency response match one another. So we take our speaker that is farthest away and we tune that to whichever curve that it mimics naturally the best. But then we take our next speaker and we tune it to our first speaker that we've already done, and not necessarily pay as much attention to what our curve is at that point in time. So we want the frequency response to match between the speakers themselves. The second pillar is level. Again, left and right should match in terms of level. And if we started with that farther speaker away, it is really going to help us out in getting those levels to match easily without having to get any type of boosting scenarios. Finally, we have phase, or the timing of each channel should be the same. Now, before we move on, let's talk about what the real goal is here. Knowing what we know, that on boats, it's more about the zone than it is in individual listening. How vital is imaging? I would really contend that it should not be forgotten about, but I would just put it as a lower priority. So for me, getting our levels and our frequency response dialed in is really the top two priorities, with going and getting your timing and phase alignment being a little bit lower there. So instead, let's really take a look at the two zone itself. And the first two pillars are vital to getting the entire zone to sound good. And the third can play a part, but let's really start off with pillar one and talk about that. When we want to make changes to the frequency response, we use EQ, which is right. But if we're using a normal amp and there is no EQ, what does a normal amp have that can make some changes that will help with the frequency response? Built-in volume control. Beyond contrary belief, that is not a built-in volume control. That's your input sensitivity. So you can use your high-pass and low-pass filters if you're not using something with DSP. And making sure that you have those filters set up prior is very important for protecting your smaller drivers, but it's also going to help you optimize the speaker to perform within the band of frequencies it's intended to play. Of course, if you have an EQ, it is a great tool to use, and absolutely use them. You'll have 10-band parametric EQ capabilities with the MVI. Depending on how the system's set up, you could have a 10-band parametric for a zone, or you can have a 10-band parametric for each individual speaker. So let's take a look at what we're trying to achieve with our system and our EQing. So here's a left and right measured response of a vehicle in specific. So you'll get the same kind of response in a vessel. However, you may notice that your upper end is a little bit higher because you're going to deal with a little bit different reflections and a different tuned speakers that you have installed in there too. So you can see that we overlaid them into a target curve. And you can see that that frequency taper is already pretty darn close to what the target is. And that's why we specifically chose that specific target curve. Now, the upper end has a pretty natural roll-off too. Now, the energy that we are looking at is raw in its un-EQ'd state and is mostly above the target curve. Well, why? We have it above the target curve because we're going to actually use the EQ to cut down as much to our target curve. If we had the target curve laid in higher, then we would be tending to want to boost to that target curve, where cutting to that target curve is a lot better practice.
Right, and something I'll add here, Kevin, is the reason we like to cut is in some applications, the dips in the measured response are related to a timing issue where the left or right is out of sync, so to speak, like a phase or a relational issue. And if you try to boost a valley, you might wind up, I won't say what I usually say about this, but wasting a lot of time and energy trying to compensate for something that you can't fix with an EQ. So using cut, you can have a much better success rate of getting closer to that target curve. So everything is said about put the target curve at the lower point of the measured response so that when you cut it down, you can normalize it to that target. And then the last step, as you'll see, is to bring the levels back up so you don't castrate the system. You still need it to play loud.
Right, right. So you can see we've gone through, we've made our cuts. The energy is now starting to get pretty closely grouped to our target line. There's still work to be done, but we want to go through and listen to it at this point. We've gotten it pretty darn close. We're within our range, so we want to go through and probably take a listen to it at this point in time. Now, once we get these two speakers to match, if there are more speakers in that zone, then you want to go through and dial those two or those other speakers into the zone to match what these left and right are at this point in time. Now, since marine speakers are mainly coaxial, we don't have as much flexibility with the crossover points and being able to make adjustments for your high pass and low pass filters to take care of some of the issues. So having that parametric EQ really, really helps out and comes into play when we are tuning and making these cuts. So once you get the frequency responses for all of the zones dialed in, you should move on to set your output levels. Of course, setting levels from left to right channels is important. You don't want the left side screaming loud and the right side barely audible. So if you can adjust these levels by channels, go ahead and do that and make sure that they line up with one another. Another aspect of setting levels is when dealing with marine systems is the entire zone, is making sure that all zones are playing nice and playing at about the same level as one another. And this makes sense for any zones that will overlap and that the listener can travel to easily. So like a towboat that we have here, the listener can start off in the bow and work their way back to the stern area fairly easily. So we want to make sure that all of those zones have the same amount of intensity, so that way there's no hot spots throughout the vessel. So once you get that done, play some music at a moderate level and walk through the boat with your SPL meter. The goal is to get the levels to be about the same as you go from the bow to the helm area and all the way to the stern. This does not need to be absolutely perfect. It is hard to get a good solid number, especially if we're doing this with music. But I still recommend doing it so that way you can actually go through and be able to listen to each zone and be able to hear if there's any weird tonality differences between the two or three at this point, and if there's any affecting areas there. Steve?
Absolutely do it with music and just casually stroll through as if you were a participant at the party, so to speak. You're just kind of walking through, listening to the music, and the meter's telling you if the level's right. You can rely on your ears as well, but the meter gives you a nice number and a nice solid reference. In some cases, if let's just say you only have a pair of 6.5s up in the bow and you have like 4 880s in the cockpit area and another 4 of them in the stern, you're just not going to be able to get those levels to be exactly the same. So at that point, get the main area, the big loud area, to be as powerful as possible, and don't try to kill the bow to keep up, except that it can only get so loud with a less dynamic system there.
Yeah, and then like Steve said earlier, after your levels are all set, the nice thing in Tune software is you can link all of the levels together and then raise them up. And just make sure that you're paying attention to your output clipping indicators as you are raising those levels to make sure that you get the maximum performance out of the outputs, but without getting into any trouble there. So we have done 2 of the 3 pillars covers. Now's a good point that on most marine system, imaging in the true meaning of the term is not a normal goal for boats. Being able to walk through the entire vessel and have an equal listening experience really is the most important. So since imaging is not about localizing images since imaging is about localizing instruments and sounds on a soundstage, it assumes that the listener is not moving around, and it also assumes that there's a single listener in the boat. Boats very rarely allow for this. Think about this. Even when you're towing, you're probably sitting down, standing up, doing all of that stuff. So you are moving around even as the captain or even as you're driving that vessel. So it's very, very hard to get that timing and that phase adjusted for that specific area. Now, you can use some delay, and we can utilize this in some of the presets too when we're dealing with a preset that's affecting one area, especially if the customer wants a single driver listener, listening position. You can go ahead and set that up. However, for the most part, you may delay the subs and getting them to match with the mid-bass drivers, and that's going to be the main portion of your delaying, is just getting that sub to mid-bass driver transition taken care of. Alrighty, so let's get in and let's talk about some of the presets here. So some of your common presets are your driver's focus, your sandbar, your rider, dock party, your cruising, and your tower speaker controls. The first preset that we're going to talk a little bit about here is your dock party preset. And remember, we did tuning to this specific zone. So going ahead and making a preset for this is just going in and making some minor adjustments maybe to the stern area, because that may have a direct correlation into this area. So just keep that in mind. Or maybe you want to turn off the bow speakers and the cockpit speakers because everybody's more in the back side of the vessel here. So realistically, we're not having to do much work to go ahead and make this as a preset. You may consider again, minimal delay to help just couple the subs to the mains. You may want to change the frequency response a little bit depending on how far the distance is for your dock party or for your listening environment off the backside there. Now, driver to optimize, this is where you can really go through and show off and really dial the entire system into that specific one location. Use your signal delay on your speakers, all of them that will impact the driver. Just go ahead and take tape measurements. You can use, we call it your precision delay finder or your tape measurement. Just make sure when you're making those measurements, you're taking the same spot on each speaker. I normally just say take the center of the driver. It makes it easy just as a reference to go through. You take the center, because that way it's the center of a 6.5, it's the center of an 880, it's the center of a 770. Doesn't really matter. So I normally just say use the center of that. So you can really dial it in for this and really show off what your skills are when making those. But keep in mind, you have to make sure that your levels are all adjusted for that specific listener also. So it's not just your timing, but we need to make sure our frequency response and our levels are set up for that position. Now, preset 3 is kind of similar to the driver optimized setting. This is going to be our cruising setting, but it's not a single point where the driver is. This is going to be in the center of everybody. Now, again, we may want to turn off our bow speakers at this point in time. We definitely want to make sure that our tower speakers are not on at this point in time, but we want to make sure that it's nice, it's comfortable, and we want to tune all of the speakers that may influence that area, which may differ between the different vessels that you're working with. This specific vessel, your bow speakers may or may not really affect that specific area. So if you've already had your tune set up for that area, then you can go ahead and just maybe turn off the bow speakers, turn off the tower speakers, and just have that nice cruising ones. Or you can just have the bow going on if it's not directly affecting it as much.
This is probably your most popular preset right here.
Yeah, I was just about to say, this one's going to be your most popular, especially for the adults. This is where everybody's sitting back. If it's not the most perfect day, you know, the windshield, that gives you a little bit of reprieve from the wind and all of that good stuff. So it is a nice, quieter area to sit in and relax. So it really is probably the most used one in there. All right, the fourth preset is your rider behind your boat at some distance. Again, tune all of the speakers that will be audible that far from the boat. So probably the main ones that you're doing are your towers that you've already gone through and tuned previously. So again, it's just making this a preset. And again, like Steve said, don't try to rail the subs up to make sure that they compensate for back there. You can have more subs, but make sure you're not exceeding the limits of the drivers themselves. So you may want to turn down the subs a lot for the cruising one because you're just out there enjoying it. And if you want to turn them up for this, you can. Just make sure that you're not trying to rail them to where you're exceeding it, the limitations of the speakers. So, and again, if you're out on the sandbar and out there partying and all of that good stuff, you want to be able to tune for that. You can use, again, minimal signal delay on the speakers to help couple them with the subwoofers, just to get that little bit more output from that sub-mid-bass transition there. But really, you're going to enhance the frequency response for any speakers that are affecting that outside source. Again, the bow speakers, you may not even have them turned on this type of preset. They may be completely shut off, so because they're really not going to affect listening far back there. So just keep that in mind. Now, preset 5 is showing off everything that the MVI can do. We're just going to set it up as a more traditional amplifier. We're just going to use our high-pass filters, our low-pass filters, and do some input sensitivity settings on there, or some level settings on there, to make sure that it is acting like it would be a regular M series or a regular type of amplifier on there. So that way the customer knows, or that you know what you're getting when you start switching to some of all of these presets, and really show off what the MVI can do. This is really important, especially if you're doing a demo boat for a store, or if you're just trying to show off what your tuning skills are at that point too. So you have that one that doesn't have any DSP on there, and it really, really will show off what your skills are. So
that one, I got to be honest with you, that's the hardest one of all of them, because you have to make sure that you scale back the level of the no DSP setting. And it sounds deceptive and weird, but when you tune a system, since you're using cut an awful lot, you're going to pull out some of the energy of the system. So naturally, it's not going to be as loud, even after you adjust the levels, because you pulled some of the energy out. If you don't have the ability to dial it in and balance the energy, parts of it are going to be really freaking loud. And you need to kind of bring that back, because loud almost always is going to sound good. There's lots of people that they don't hear the tonal balance. They just hear how loud something is, and they think that is just naturally better. So in order to do a proper demonstration of what DSP can really do, and what a proper tune can be, you really want to make sure that no DSP version has some of the level pulled out of it just by adjusting the input sensitivity, or you can use the output level trim just to make it balanced with, at the very least, like the party mode or the cruising mode, the one that's got the most energy. So kind of balance it to that and show this is when it's tuned and this is when it's not tuned. So you can actually demonstrate that you've made an improvement without killing the level.
Right. No, it's a good point, Steve. Absolutely. So just going in and a quick summary here. Tuning a boat is very different than tuning your mobile or home system. You should consider really tuning each zone as a separate system rather than the entire boat as one. When it comes to using the power of the DSP and the MVI products, again, you may be tempted to optimize the setting for a specific listener. And you can go through and do that if you want to. Just however, keep in mind that each zone will affect one another, and you don't have to do it to a specific person, but do it by the zone itself. Choose a frequency response curve and choose one that is going to mimic what the boat is showing you naturally. It's going to save you a lot of headaches, and it's going to help out at the end point there. And consider any type of contributors to each zone. In the stern area, you're going to have a motor more than likely that's probably going to have a little bit more noise. In the bow, when you're cruising at 40 miles an hour, you're going to have a lot of wind noise going on up there too. So just take into consideration what some of these outside factors are going to contribute to each zone there. Use your presets. They are going to help you out. Doing a quick search on kind of OEM kind of systems that are going on and what people don't like or what people think are confusing about the system in their vessel is maybe they're not using a preset to set up being able to turn off the level control of your tower speakers or anything like that. So use the presets to make it simple for the user to use. If it's not easy and it is difficult, then the experience might not be happy. So using the presets to simplify everything for the user is very, very important. Alrighty, and that's going to wrap up our session here. I'm going to actually log out and we'll go back to full screen. So if you guys have any questions, I know Steve covered a lot of these as we were going through.
And thank you for that. So, Rob, I didn't see a whole lot of other chatter other than what we've already covered. Did you see anything in Facebook that needed to be addressed?
I've seen, but one thing I want to go back that Kevin mentioned that I think is extremely important to remember here with all of this, yes, Marine, it's loud, it's fun, but I think what Kevin said was, the equal performance is extremely important. You don't want to be in different parts of the vessel where it sounds totally different. So, that's why we always recommend lots of speakers on boats, because it helps disperse equal sound as they get further apart from one another. And then adding the DSP to the mix further allows us to, even if we have 6.5s all throughout, speakers, you don't want to go to the bow and it's not as fun as the stern and cockpit section of the vessel. So, but being able to use the DSP and the levels and equalize the performance, for me, that it's big. It's a social party environment. And the other thing about time delay or signal delay, I never thought it really would matter on a vessel. So I'm like, oh, you don't need a center image. But it can be extremely helpful. I remember sitting in a towboat that Manville had tuned back in R&D a while back, and this is pre-MVI. We had put some tweaks on it, and we were just trying some stuff out. And he had a raw preset, which was just the base system. He had a preset where everything was signal delayed, including the bow, all the way to the dead center of the vessel, which sounded great. But then there was the captain's delay. And I always remember one of our sales guys spun around when that preset turned on, and he looked at Manville and said, "What did you do to the subwoofer? I have never heard the sub sound. It's like you added 6 dB of boost." And Manville said, "I didn't do anything except delay it, everything to the captain's chair." So by delaying the coaxials in the boat and the sub, so they arrived at the captain's chair at the same time, it was like he did a 6+ dB boost on the subwoofer, when it was all because of time. So there are some cool things you can do with that signal delay. It's not always necessarily for that center image, but it can help bring back to life some of those frequencies that get lost due to cancellations and such.
Right on. Actually, you bring up an excellent point. If you do have a boat that's more open down the center of it, in your mind, if you wanted to tune it and use some of the delay, like Rob was just describing, for the captain's seat or for a main listening area, basically imagine a center line down the middle of the boat, and that becomes your point, and you could tune to each one of the locations and delay things. So let's just say that center line down the boat that Kevin was using in his example, since you could literally walk right down the middle, just imagine that path and have somebody standing in the aft section. Well, that's your point to measure to if you want to use delay for that section. Do the same thing in the midship. That's your point for delay right down the middle line. And then up in the bow, again, the same exact thing. So all those center positions, you can use some delay, like Kevin mentioned as well, to try to optimize all of that. Now, if you have a single spot for all of it, that could be magical, as you described when our sales guy was really blown away by how much better it could sound. And that's truly showing the full benefit of it. But as Kevin mentioned earlier in the presentation, that as great as you make it for a single location, you're probably pulling away performance from some of the other locations. So it's a bit of I hate using the word balancing act, but it's kind of what it is, because you can't make it perfect for every single seat. So you have to make some choices about how to get a really great experience for as many places on the boat as possible.
That's where those presets come in.
Right.
Without a doubt. So Glenn was asking for a marine DRC. Shame on you, Glenn. Shame, shame, shame. Not only do we already have one, you trained on one in the boat. If you're using so a DRC is for the MVI product, we do have the ability to use a DRC 205, which is technically a mobile product, but you can connect it to the marine amplifiers. They're not really marine grade, but what the DRC 205 does, it's a preset selector, and it has 2 level control rings on it. There's an outer one and an inner one, and you can actually control level. And the most common configuration is either a main volume level and a sub level, or it could be a zone 1 and zone 2, or it could be a balance adjustment, or whatever the case may be. Since you already have a source unit that probably has zone control and subwoofer level control, and it certainly has a volume control, you already have the dial aspect of a DRC, but what you don't have is a preset function of a DRC. But for that, we do have the MDRC 50, which is a push button toggle for the presets on the amplifier. So yes, we kind of do already have that. So that's something that you can consider using on your demo boat. Glenn's a shop of ours that does amazing work. So I know he has a really great demo boat, and get a DRC 50 on there. Something to remember about that, the style of that button is intended to mimic a lot of the higher end switches that are on a lot of the boats that are already out there. So it is rated for marine applications as well. So Thank you, Glenn, for reminding me about that one.
So one other question that came up on Facebook chat, I answered it, but just for everyone else is the question was, is the delay auto when you put distances in for each zone? So if we're measuring to say the center of the vessel, you're going to put the distances in tune software for each speaker as is. So if the bow is 48 and 50 inches, if it's 35 and 36, input them all to that location. Tune uses an algorithm where it'll say this speaker's the furthest away. I'll apply appropriate delay to the other speakers so they all arrive at the same time. So in a way, you could say it's auto, but it's not truly auto because you got to take the measurements first. But it'll do all that hard work for you in terms of calculating what the delay will need to be based off of the distances you've put in. And then, of course, you can add additional delay if you want.
Of course. Excellent point. Good for that. All righty. Looking, we got it all?
I think so.
So I'll give a couple of seconds for the Facebook Live to catch up. And so Kevin, thank you. It was a great presentation. Covered a lot of really good things. Hopefully the group enjoyed it and learned something. As always, we're always here for any feedback you may have, both on today's presentation or this presentation, as well as any of our other ones. We're also very open and receptive to any change in dates or days, I should say, days of the week and times of day that will work better for people. Not saying we will always be able to accommodate, but we'll certainly try. And additional content and information you may want to gather from us about a given product or concept or idea, just let us know. That's what we're here for. We like doing these sessions. They're fun. We get to engage with many of you in the chats and whatnot, and that's always very, very beneficial to us, both as JL Audio people and presenters and just people that love this stuff. So all good stuff.
Doing it for, we do this for careers, but we're enthusiasts at the end of the day. So.
Yep. All right, cool. So I guess with that, we can end the session for today, and we look forward to seeing everyone at the next one. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.